The Lottery of War, Recruitment in Vietnam and America's Broken Soul. Hello everyone and welcome to a new and exciting journey through time. If you are one of those who believe that history is just a compendium of boring dates and names, prepare to change your mind forever. What you are about to witness is not just a story of the past, it is a sensory immersion, an intimate conversation with the souls that forged our present. Have you ever wondered how those who lived through the crucial moments in history really felt? What did they think? What did they fear? What did they hope for? Here we don't just tell the story, but we live through the eyes of those who were there. Fasten your seatbelt, because the past is calling and the adventure begins now. In the heart of New York, hidden between skyscrapers and the constant hum of the city, is Daniel's library. It is not an ordinary library. Its shelves not only hold thousands of volumes of wisdom accumulated over the centuries, but also the portal to those centuries. Daniel, a 36-year-old historian with an insatiable thirst for knowledge and a unique ability to cross the barrier of time, uses this personal sanctuary to do what no other historian can: dialogue directly with the figures who starred in the annals of humanity. Its mission is simple and at the same time monumental: to understand. Understand the motivations behind big decisions, the doubts in moments of crisis, the humanity behind the myth. He has already walked the desert sands with Geronimo, debating resistance and identity, has shared reflections on freedom with Abraham Lincoln in the difficult days of the Civil War, and he has felt the disruptive energy when talking with Nikola Tesla about the future he envisioned. He has also explored deep compassion when speaking with Mother Teresa or the complexities of power with Salvador Allende. These and many other conversations, each a treasure of learning and perspective, wait to be discovered in our next stories or in the book that chronicles these unique experiences. I remember once, chatting with Lincoln, I asked him how he endured the constant pressure, the weight of the nation on his shoulders. He looked at me with those tired but steady eyes and, after a brief silence, told me a story about an old Illinois farmer and his stubborn mule, a story that, beneath the comical surface, revealed a philosophy of perseverance and humility that left a deep impression on me. It is those moments, those personal revelations, that Daniel seeks on each trip. This time, fate takes us to a time of deep division and conflict, to a time when the future of thousands of young Americans hung in the balance of a lottery. We will delve into the life of one of them, a young man invented for this narrative, but whose experience resonates with that of so many other real people, to understand what it meant to be called to the Vietnam War. Mandatory military conscription, popularly known as the draft, has been a tool used by the United States in several conflicts, but reached an unprecedented level of scrutiny and controversy during the Vietnam War. As American involvement in the conflict intensified in the mid-1960s, the need for troops grew exponentially. The selective service system, which already existed, became the main source of personnel for the military. Young men upon turning 18 were required to register. The process became particularly contentious due to several factors. First, the deferment system allowed university students, those with certain professions or family responsibilities, to postpone or avoid service. This led to the widespread perception that the draft was unfair and disproportionately burdened the working classes and minorities, who had less access to higher education or other avenues to obtain deferments. Universities were filled with young people seeking to avoid war, often without a genuine interest in studies, only because of the postponement. The draft lottery, introduced in 1969, attempted to address some of these inequities by assigning priority numbers based on randomly drawn birth dates. Although it sought to be more fair, it did not completely eliminate exemptions or resistance. The Vietnam War, in addition to being increasingly unpopular, was the first televised war. Images of the conflict reached American homes every night, confronting the population with the brutal reality of war and the growing number of casualties. This fueled a powerful anti-war movement, led primarily by youth, students, and civil rights activists. Protests multiplied, from mass marches to acts of civil disobedience and burning of draft cards. For many young men, receiving draft notice was a life-changing moment, forcing them to make difficult decisions. Accept the call to an unpopular and dangerous war, seek a deferment or exemption, often through morally questionable means, or resist the draft, facing possible prison sentences or exile. Recruiting for Vietnam was not just an administrative process. It was a catalyst for social change, an ignition point for youth activism, and a deep wound in the American psyche that would take years to heal.
Chapter 1. The White Envelope. The Lottery That Changed a Destiny. The air in Daniel's library always had a particular aroma, a mix of old paper, leather, and ozone, left over from countless trips through the space-time continuum. Tonight, the tension in the air was almost palpable. Daniel, at 36 years old, moved with the familiarity of someone who travels between eras like others take the subway. He paused in front of the 20th Century American History section, not to read, but to tune into the temporal resonance of that era. He looked in an old expedition trunk for the right clothing: flared pants of a dull earth color, a simple cotton shirt, and a light jacket with several pockets. He needed to go unnoticed in 1969, blend in with the environment without standing out. Every fold of the clothing, every seam, had been authenticated, designed to withstand the peculiarities of the journey and the time. He adjusted his glasses, which were not only for seeing, but also discrete tools for recording and analysis. He took a deep breath, anchoring himself in the present before taking the leap. If you are wondering how it is possible to witness these moments, how Daniel achieves the unthinkable, let me tell you something. History is not dead, it is waiting to be discovered. And the way we discover it here, through real conversations, palpable dilemmas, and the adventure of a time traveler, is a gift. A gift that expands your knowledge, that makes you see the world and people with different eyes. How many times have you read about a historical event and been left wanting to know more, to feel it? Here we break that barrier. Subscribe, activate notifications, and join this adventure of knowledge. Allow yourself the luxury of traveling through time with us, of witnessing human greatness and fragility. Are you ready for history to come to life before your eyes? The library hummed. The lights flickered. The thousands of books seemed to vibrate in unison as the portal opened, not like a door, but like a warm, luminous distortion in the center of the room. Daniel took a step forward, not into the light, but through it, into the whirlwind of time. The calm before the draw. The air in Ohio in the fall of 1969 was crisp and smelled of fallen leaves and the imminence of winter. Daniel appeared in a quiet alley behind a row of wooden houses, camouflaged by the time warp. He adjusted his clothes, checking that his appearance did not give away his origin. He had a mission: to find Thomas Adams, a young man whose name had appeared in historical records as one of the thousands of lives marked by the draft lottery that inaugural year. He walked along tree-lined streets, watching the cars passing by, late 60s models, shiny and bulky, and listening to the music coming out of the open windows. Rock and roll, folk protest. The social tension was palpable. American flags flew from some porches, while on others, peace symbols or makeshift anti-war banners suggested deep division in the community. He found the Adams house, a modest dwelling with a small, manicured front garden. The radio played from inside, tuning in to the evening news. Daniel approached, posing as a college pollster interested in public opinion on current events. A woman with a kind but tired face opened the door. "Mrs. Adams." "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm from Ohio University, doing a survey on the national situation. Would you be so kind as to answer some questions about the environment these days?" Mrs. Adams hesitated for a moment, but the mention of the university seemed to calm her. She led him into the living room, neat but modest, with family photos on a shelf and newspapers stacked. In the corner, a young man was sitting in an armchair, staring at the radio. Had to be Thomas. He was about 20 years old, of slim build, with his hair combed to the side, a common style of the time. His face reflected a mixture of anxiety and something akin to resignation. "Thomas, say hello to the young man," Mrs. Adams said in a soft voice. Thomas turned his head slowly. His eyes, of an indefinite color between green and gray, had a depth that did not correspond to his youth. "Hello," he murmured, looking back at the radio. Daniel sat down, taking out a small notebook. "Hi, Thomas. We're talking a little about, well, everything that's going on. The war, the protests, and the draft." The last word seemed to echo through the room like a funeral bell. Mrs. Adams sat across from him, clasping her hands in her lap. "It is an issue that has us worried, young man. My Thomas. He is registered. The draw is tomorrow." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had arrived just in time for the key day. "I understand. It must be a difficult time for many families." Thomas finally spoke, his voice low. "Difficult is an understatement. It's like a sword of Damocles. You don't know if your life is going to follow the path you planned, or if suddenly you're going to be sent thousands of miles away to do something that many of us don't even understand anymore." Daniel noticed the frustration in her voice. "Thomas, if it's not an indiscretion, what are your plans, your hopes for the future outside of this?" "Well, go to university, study engineering. I had a plan. A life. Now everything depends on a number," Mrs. Adams added with a sigh. His older brother was already in the army. He came back different. Very different. That's why this scares us so much. The anecdote, small but loaded with meaning, painted the family backdrop. The weight and the doubt. The hours passed slowly. Daniel remained in the house, excusing himself with the extension of the survey. He observed the family dynamic, marked by the anxiety of the next day. Thomas's father arrived from work, a large, silent man, who nodded to Daniel and then sat in his chair, reading the newspaper with feigned concentration. The topic of the draft was in the air, not explicitly said all the time, but always present. Daniel, with subtle questions, tried to elicit more about Thomas's perspective. "Thomas, what do you think of the protests? Of the young people demonstrating against the war?" Thomas shrugged. "I understand them. Who wants to go die in a place where they don't want us, for a cause that seems to get more confusing every day? I also see my father. He believes in duty in the country. He grew up in another time. It's complicated. Have you considered other options? A postponement, perhaps?" "I've thought of everything," Thomas interrupted, his voice taking on an edge it didn't have before. "I could try to enroll full-time at university, but we don't have much money for that without a scholarship. I could claim health problems, but I feel fine. I could go to Canada." He said the last option almost in a whisper, looking askance at his father. The father put down the newspaper. "Going to Canada is turning your back. It's not doing your part." His voice was firm, without a trace of anger, but with palpable disappointment. Thomas didn't respond, but the tension between them was evident. Daniel perceived that the decision was not only between war and peace, but also between family/patriotic duty and one's own survival/conviction. What path would Thomas take if his number came out low? That night, Daniel stayed at a nearby motel, the distant sound of sirens breaking the silence. He reflected on the stories he had heard. Thomas's uncertainty, his mother's fear, his father's silent sense of duty. They were microcosms of the drama that was being experienced in thousands of American homes. A draw. The next morning, December 1, 1969, the nation held its breath. In Washington, D.C., the first drawing of the draft lottery would take place. Plastic balls containing the 366 dates of the year, including February 29th, would be mixed and drawn at random, determining the order in which men ages 18 to 26 would be called to serve. A low number almost certainly meant conscription. A high number, temporary salvation. Daniel returned to the Adams house. The atmosphere was charged. The entire family was gathered around the small black and white television, which showed grainy images of the drawing room. Commentators spoke in solemn voices about the fairness of the process, a claim that many already questioned. On the screen, an official placed the balls into a large transparent glass container. The tension in the Adams living room could be cut with a knife. Thomas was pale, sitting on the edge of his seat, his hands clenched. His mother prayed in a low voice. His father kept a stony expression. Daniel watched, feeling the gravity of the historical moment through this family's deeply personal experience. They began to extract the dates. The first ball, September 14th. Someone on the screen announced the priority number. 1. A murmur went through the drawing room and living rooms across the country. On April 24th, 2. On February 14th, 3. The list of dates and their priority numbers was announced quickly. Every low number drawn was a verdict for thousands of young people. Thomas had his birth date etched in his mind, May 18th. He nervously looked for the date in the list that formed on the screen. On May 18th, the official on the screen announced, May 18th, priority number 30. A gasp escaped Mrs. Adams. The father exhaled loudly, the newspaper forgotten on the floor. Thomas froze for a moment, his eyes fixed on the screen. Number 30. Very low number. It meant almost certainly that he would be called up. The promise of going to college, the plan to study engineering, the life I imagined. It all dissolved in the cold Ohio air. Instead of books and classrooms, the future now smelled of humidity, jungle, and fear. The white envelope would arrive soon, but the draw had already delivered its verdict. The lottery of war had claimed another life, another broken soul in the heart of America. Thomas's gaze met Daniel's for a moment. There was no recognition, only the lost look of someone who had just faced an abyss. Daniel felt the weight of personal and collective history in that exchange of glances. What would this young man do now? The story was not over. It was just beginning for Thomas Adams.
Chapter 2. Crossroads in the heart of the storm. Duty, fear, and defiance. The news of number 30 spread through the Adams household like a sudden frost. The momentary relief that the draw had passed gave way to the harsh reality of what that number implied. Thomas felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. The television continued announcing dates and numbers, a rosary of sealed destinies, but he was no longer listening. He only felt the ringing in his ears and the tightness in his chest. Daniel watched from a respectful background. I had witnessed moments of elation and despair on the other side of the portal, but the charged stillness of this living room had a particular intensity. They were not kings or generals dealing with the fate of nations, but a family dealing with the fate of one of their most beloved members. Thomas. His mother began, her voice breaking. She approached him, as if she wanted to physically protect him from the news. The father, after a long silence, stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the street as if the answer was there. Number 30. It's low. What does that mean, Dad? Thomas asked, even though he already knew. It means they'll call you soon. The father turned, his face a mask of mixed emotions. Concern for his son, a deep-rooted sense of duty he could not betray, and perhaps a pang of envy for Thomas's youth, faced with a war he himself did not have to fight in the same way. Daniel decided to intervene delicately, returning to his role as interviewer. Thomas, what's going through your head now, after knowing the number? Thomas looked at him, his eyes reflecting an inner storm. Chaos, anger, fear, and confusion. My number came up, now what? I'm supposed to go. It's my duty, right? That's what I've always been taught. Serve your country. The weight of the decision. The days that followed were a silent battlefield in the Adams home. The Selective Service's white envelope had not yet arrived, but its imminence loomed over them. Meals were tense, conversations superficial or non-existent. Thomas spent hours alone in his room or taking long aimless walks around the neighborhood. Daniel, maintaining his facade, managed to have more conversations with Thomas, often finding him in a small nearby park, sitting under an old oak tree. It's funny, Thomas told Daniel on one of those cool afternoons. Until recently, war was something far away, something you saw on the news or in the movies. Now it has my name on it. Have you talked to anyone else about this? Daniel asked. With my friends. Some have high numbers and are relieved. Others have low numbers like me, and we are all the same. We discuss, what are we going to do? Some are already thinking about the National Guard or the Reserve, if they can get in, to avoid Vietnam. Others are more serious about leaving the country. And you? Thomas sighed, a slow, heavy exhale. I don't know. A part of me, the part that grew up with stories of World War II, watching my father respect the flag, that part says go. It's what's expected of a man. He paused, picking up a fallen leaf. But another part, the part that reads the newspapers, that sees the images from there, that listens to those who come back, that part screams run. I don't want to go kill anyone. I don't want to die for something I don't understand. Daniel perceived the deep internal conflict. It was not cowardice, it was a genuine struggle between inherited duty and an emerging conscience, informed by a complex and brutal reality. Voices of resistance and duty. Daniel set out to show Thomas the different perspectives of the time. She accompanied him to an anti-war rally on the nearby university campus. The atmosphere was electric. Thousands of young people carried banners with slogans such as "Make Love," "Not War," and "Out of Vietnam." Passionate speakers denounced the immorality of the conflict, the injustice of the draft, and the hypocrisy of the government. Folk music with messages of protest resonated in the air. Thomas watched with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. I've never been in anything like this, he commented to Daniel over the noise. It's intense. I've never heard so many people speak so openly against the war. Daniel introduced him to a young student who had publicly burned his draft card. It was the most terrifying and liberating moment of my life, the student told them, his eyes shining with conviction. I can't fight a war I don't believe in. The risk of prison is high, I know. But I couldn't live with myself if I went to Vietnam. Later, Daniel took Thomas to a bar where war veterans gathered. The atmosphere was different, loud, alcohol-infused, with an undercurrent of camaraderie forged in adversity, but also a heaviness that Thomas's youth had not yet known. He spoke to a Marine who had recently returned. The man, weathered and with a distant look, did not talk much about the fighting, but rather about the heat, humidity, confusion, and the constant feeling of danger. You do what you have to do, he finally told her, shrugging his shoulders. You accomplish your mission. You don't think about why, only about surviving and taking care of your companions. These two experiences, that of the passionate activist and that of the laconic veteran, represented two sides of a bitter coin. Both were valid, both colored by the context of the war. How could a young man like Thomas reconcile such opposing views? Daniel realized that the decision was not just logical, but visceral, moral, and deeply personal. What was more important? Perceived duty to the state or individual conscience? Loyalty to the family and its traditions or the search for one's own path? The B-52 flyover. One night, as Thomas and Daniel walked near a military base, the sky rent with the deafening roar of a B-52 bomber taking off. The enormous silhouette crossed the dark sky, an imposing and terrifying war machine that was undoubtedly heading to the other side of the world. The sound vibrated in Thomas's chest. He stopped, staring at the plane until it became a tiny in the distance. That. Thomas began, his voice barely audible above the residual noise. That's what my number could send me to. There was a long silence. Daniel said nothing, allowing the moment to speak for itself. The B-52 was the tangible embodiment of distant war, of real danger, of potential death. Thomas turned to Daniel, his face dimly illuminated by the light of a nearby street lamp. The indecision of the last few days seemed to crystallize into an imminent decision. In his eyes there was not only fear, but also a new determination, although Daniel could not yet discern where that determination was pointing. "I've thought a lot," Thomas said, his voice firm. "I have listened to my father, my mother, my friends, those who protest, those who have been there. But in the end, it is my life." He paused, as if he were taking a leap into the void. The cold night wind played with her hair. The roar of the B-52 had faded, but the echo remained in the air. "I know what I have to do," he finally said. The decision was not easy, it was not popular with everyone, but it was to the water. The white envelope would arrive, but the final verdict would not be given by the government, nor by the lottery, nor even by his family. He would give it himself, at the crossroads of his own soul. The road would be difficult, riddled with uncertainty and possible reproaches, but for the first time in days, Thomas Adams did not seem lost. He seemed determined.
Chapter 3. Echoes from the front and cries at home. The battle on two fronts. The air in the Adams living room was no longer heavy with uncertainty, but with a tense stillness, the kind that precedes an impending storm. Thomas had made his decision after the night of B-52, a decision he communicated to his parents with a firmness that hardly befitted his age. "I wouldn't go to Vietnam." He would not show up for induction. Daniel, maintaining his discreet presence, witnessed the reaction. Mrs. Adams burst into tears, a mix of relief for her son's immediate safety and fear of legal repercussions. Thomas's father reacted with silent fury, his face turning red as he spoke of duty, honor, and the shame he would feel. It was a painful conversation, full of reproaches and generational misunderstandings, an echo of the conflict that divided the country at that precise moment. Thomas stood his ground, pale but resolute, explaining that he could not, in good conscience, participate in that war. The decision and its domestic repercussions. The relationship at home changed drastically. Thomas's father barely spoke to him, viewing him as a coward or, worse still, a traitor to the principles he held sacred. The mother was torn between her protective instinct and her loyalty to her husband, caught in the middle of the emotional crossfire. Thomas felt isolated in his own home, the moral victory he felt for having acted on his conscience clouded by the painful family rift. Daniel talked with Thomas in the park, where he was now taking refuge from the oppressive environment of his house. "It was worse than I expected," Thomas confessed, kicking a loose rock. "My father. I've let him down terribly. Phil. I feel like a part of him has broken." You made a difficult decision, Thomas. Following your conscience. That requires a different courage, perhaps more difficult than going to war for some. Courage? I don't know. I just know that I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend that it was okay to go to a place where we would bomb towns and people would die for something I don't defend. But at what cost? My own family. My father. He stopped, staring into the horizon. Meanwhile, the white envelope arrived. An official notification, cold and impersonal, ordering Thomas Adams to report to the induction center on a specific date. To him, it was just a piece of paper, but to his parents, it was the embodiment of their defiance, proof that Thomas was about to break federal law. Tension at home increased even more. Echoes of the far front. Although Thomas had decided not to go, the Vietnam War was still present in their lives through the news. Daniel made sure Thomas saw and heard the echoes from the front. He showed him newspapers with headlines about offensives, casualties, and the increasing brutality of the conflict. They listened to radio reports from the field. One afternoon, they heard a particularly crude report about an ambushed patrol. The depiction of fear, confusion, and random violence was visceral. Thomas paled as he listened. That's what I saved, he murmured. But hearing it, does that mean I left them alone? Those who did go, those who had no other choice, or those who did believe in it? Daniel knew that this was the other side of the coin of resistance. Survivor's guilt, doubt about whether one's conviction justified letting others face danger in their place. It's a question many have asked, Thomas. And it doesn't have a simple answer. Some would argue that your decision, and that of many others, was part of what ultimately helped end the war to raise awareness. Others will always see those who stayed as deserters. The anti-war movement was also gaining strength. Daniel took Thomas to observe a mass protest in a nearby city. The crowd was enormous, thousands of people of all ages, but predominantly young, marching, chanting slogans and carrying candles in memory of the fallen. It was a collective cry of anguish, rage, and hope. Look at them, Daniel said. You are not alone, Thomas. There is a country divided by this. There is an entire generation questioning what they have been taught about war and patriotism. Thomas watched the rally, feeling a connection to the energy of the crowd. They were the screams at home, the counterpoint to the echoes from the front. It was the other battle, the one that was fought in the streets, in the universities, in homes, for the soul of America. Call of selective service. Induction day arrived. Thomas didn't show up. He knew that his name would be on a list, that a file would be opened. The act of not going was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a new fight. A few days later, while Daniel was with him, the phone rang at the Adams home. The sound seemed to pierce the silence. Mrs. Adams attended to him, her face tensing as she listened. It's the selective service, she told her husband and Thomas, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas's father took the phone, his posture rigid. Daniel and Thomas listened, their hearts pounding. The conversation was brief, peppered with monosyllables on the father's part. He hung up the phone, silence falling again. He looked at Thomas, an unreadable expression on his face. They say you didn't show up. They ask why. They've opened a case. They say they'll send you more notices. And if you don't respond, they could issue a warrant for your arrest. The weight of the law was now upon Thomas. It was no longer just a family or moral conflict. It was a direct confrontation with the state. The path he had chosen, that of passive resistance, had serious legal consequences. He could face years in prison. Thomas's face, despite the seriousness of the news, maintained that new resolution that Daniel had seen the night of the B-52. The storm had not passed. In fact, it had intensified. But Thomas Adams was no longer the eager young man waiting for a number. He was a young man who had made a decision and was ready to face the repercussions, both at home and in the system. The battle for his personal destiny had officially joined the national battle for the future of the country. Prompt for Studio Ghibli image. In a modest house, an old telephone rings urgently on a small table in the living room. A young man, Thomas, and his parents are in the room, with expressions of tension and fear. The afternoon light enters through a window, creating a melancholic atmosphere. In the background, you can see a stack of newspapers with headlines about the war. The style should evoke a sense of imminent danger and personal drama in an everyday setting, with muted colors and a charged atmosphere.
Final reflection chapter. Scars of an era, lessons forever. The days that followed the selective service call for Thomas Adams were marked by uncertainty. The threat of an investigation and a possible arrest warrant hung over him, a gray cloud that overshadowed any hint of relief at not having to go to war. His relationship with his father remained tense. A silence loaded with implicit reproaches weighed in the air every time they were in the same room. The battle at home had become a war of emotional attrition. Daniel remained nearby, observing and, when allowed, conversing with Thomas. He found the young man in the park, under the oak tree, his personal sanctuary. The resolve on Thomas's face had hardened with tension, but his eyes still reflected the melancholy of loss. The loss of innocence, the loss of the relationship with his father as he knew it, the loss of the simple future he had imagined. The weight of consequences. "It's strange, Daniel," Thomas said one windy afternoon, as leaves fell around him. "I feel free because I know I did the right thing for me. But I also feel chained by the possible consequences. And the house feels like an enemy camp sometimes." Daniel sat next to him. "Difficult decisions often come with a high price, Thomas. Especially when they defy the expectations of those you love or the norms of your time. My father doesn't understand it. He grew up with a different idea of duty, of sacrifice for the country. For him, questioning that is unthinkable. And your generation has grown up with war on TV, with reporting that doesn't look like World War II movies, with the knowledge that leaders can be wrong. Your realities are fundamentally different. Courage for your father might be marching toward danger. For you, it might be standing still and saying no, facing the consequences here." They talked at length about different forms of courage, about the blurred line between duty and blind obedience, about how war not only destroyed bodies in distant fields, but also families and communities at home. Thomas shared his fears about the future, the possibility of prison, the idea of having to leave the country, becoming a fugitive. But despite the fear, there was a spark of conviction that hadn't existed before. He had chosen his path, however thorny it was. Echoes that resound in time. Daniel realized that the story of Thomas Adams, an anonymous young man among millions, was a perfect reflection of the Vietnam draft controversy. He was the embodiment of moral dilemmas, of the perceived injustice of the system, of deep social division. Through Thomas, I could feel the anguish of families, the rage of young people who felt trapped, the clash between generations and worldviews. He watched the news of the time, more casualties, more protests, polarization increasing. He saw how the figure of the refusnik who refused to go to war went from being an outcast to a symbol of resistance for many, although he remained a traitor for others. He watched as the anti-war movement, fueled in part by the injustices of the draft and growing awareness of the brutality of the conflict, gained momentum, eventually forcing a change in government policy. Daniel reflected on how Thomas's experience, multiplied by thousands, had a real and tangible impact on the course of history. Individual decisions of conscience, made in countless kitchens and parks under the shadow of fear, collectively became a powerful force. It was not only war that shaped history, but also resistance to it. The farewell and the lesson. Daniel's time in 1969 was coming to an end. He had witnessed the defining moment in the life of Thomas Adams and had seen the young man transform from an eager spectator to an actor in his own drama and in the national drama. In their last meeting under the oak tree, Thomas seemed calmer. The consequences were still uncertain, but the inner peace of having acted with integrity was beginning to calm the external storm. "I don't know what will happen now," Thomas said, looking at his hands. "But I know I can't undo it. And I don't want to undo it anymore. I guess I'll just have to live with this. With the decision and with whatever comes next." "Live with it, Thomas," Daniel said with a slight smile. "And learn from it. Your story is not just yours. It is the story of an era, of the difficult questions a nation had to face. And your bravery, the bravery to face yourself and your world, is a lesson that resonates through time." Daniel stood up. It was time to leave. He looked at Thomas, a young man who, despite the turbulence around him, had found a moral compass of his own in the midst of the chaos. "Thank you, Daniel," Thomas said, standing up as well. "Thank you for listening." "Thanks to you, Thomas," Daniel replied, "for reminding me that history is not just great events, but the individual lives that live them." With one last glance at Thomas Adams under the oak tree, Daniel discreetly walked away, looking for a secluded spot where he could open his portal undetected. The New York Library was waiting for him. Final reflection, scars and hope. Back in his New York sanctuary, with the familiar smell of old books and the soft hum of the door closing, Daniel took off his clothes from 1969. The experience with Thomas Adams weighed on his mind. He had traveled to understand the impact of the draft, and he had understood it through a life, a family, a decision. The Vietnam War left deep scars on American society, and the draft was one of the most painful. It divided families, pitted friends against each other, forced young people to make existential decisions under immense pressure. Thomas Adams' story was not unique. It was the story of thousands, each with its own nuances of fear, duty, conviction, and sacrifice. What Daniel took away from this trip was not just factual knowledge of events, but empathetic understanding of the human experience. He saw how courage does not always manifest itself on the battlefield, but often in the stillness of a conscience, in the act of standing firm in the face of adversity, even when that act isolates you. He saw how the lessons of the past are not mere data, but emotional echoes that can guide us in the present. Thomas's story is a reminder that even in the darkest and most confusing times, the pursuit of personal integrity is a powerful force. The scars of that era persist, but so do the lessons about the importance of questioning, reflecting, and finding one's voice in the midst of the chorus, no matter how dissonant it may be for some. And that, Daniel thought as he put away the period clothing, that is a lesson worth remembering, today and always.